Good afternoon. Before we begin, I want to introduce the individuals who are with me today. Ms. Gwen Carr, the mother of Eric Garner, who has been a tireless and fearless advocate for change. Deputy Leader of the New York State Senate, Mike Gianaris. State Senator Kevin Parker, Assembly Member Nick Perry, Assembly Member Catalina Cruz, and Michael Cizetsky, the Senior Policy Counsel for the New York Civil Liberties Union, and Neville Mitchell, an attorney for the parents on behalf of Valerie Bell, the mother of Sean Bell. Over the past year, this country has experienced some of the deep, painful, and systemic injustices in our society. I don't need to tell you the names. The death of George Floyd, Daniel Prude, Dante Wright, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, and the list goes on. And so many other unarmed men and women of color, unfortunately, have died at the hands of police. And this has rekindled a flame of righteousness and righteous indignation that has been smoldering for centuries. We are in the midst of a racial reckoning in this country. And while these killings are not new, but with more cell phones and video recordings, more people are witnessing the unbearable truth that many of us have known for a very long time. Last month, we saw a police officer convicted for the murder of George Floyd. But the Derek Chauvin verdict is exactly the exception that proves the rule. Accountability in these cases is rare. In most cases, officers who kill individuals are not even charged with a crime, let alone convicted of one. In fact, according to the Mapping Police Violence Project, less than 2% of officers are charged, and only about a quarter of those are ultimately convicted. At its core, the system was built to protect and shield officers. In fact, in New York, it is exceedingly difficult to prosecute police officers who kill civilians because of an expansive justification law that gives officers extraordinary wide latitude to use force, diminishing prosecutors' ability to hold police accountable, even when officers may be at fault or when the death was not necessary, totally preventable. And today we are taking an important step to change that reality. And so, along with my colleagues here today, I am introducing and announcing legislation to change New York State laws that govern police violence and accountability through the most far-reaching reforms in the use of force laws in the nation. The centerpiece of this effort is to amend the use of force law from one of simple necessity to one of absolute last resort. And under the current law, police officers are legally justified in using deadly force, not only to defend themselves or others, but also when they reasonably believe that an individual has committed a particular crime. So let me give you an example. So under our current law, an officer who suspects an individual attempted to commit the crime of arson, even if that attempted act occurred 2 weeks prior, that officer could be justified in using legal force to arrest that person or prevent his or her escape. In a situation like this, an officer can use the justification statute as a means of avoiding the legal liability for using force. And even in cases where the officer is allegedly defending themselves or others, where there is essentially no consideration of whether the officer could have used alternative means to resolve the situation and preserve the individual's life, such as give a warning, such as de-escalation, such as communication, such as distancing the individual. Did they seek to de-escalate the situation? Did they exhaust all practical and reasonable alternatives? Did their own conduct create the circumstances that are later used to justify employing deadly force? Our goal today is to preserve lives by making sure that under the law, lethal force is the last resort. And while there is legitimate reason why police officers have some special protections, those protections should not preclude them from being held accountable when they needlessly take the life of another or unnecessarily use excessive amounts of force. If there is a way to accomplish the officer's objective short of lethal force, we should absolutely demand that they take that other path. This bill will explicitly require officers to consider whether the same end can be accomplished with non-deadly force or no force at all. It will mandate that an officer only use deadly force when they truly believe it is necessary, and that a reasonable person in the same position would also hold that belief. It will ensure that lethal force is deemed appropriate only when a threat is truly imminent, which is what officers are already taught and is already outlined in their patrol guide. So this is an attempt to codify that which exists in an officer's patrol guide. I want to be clear. Now, this is not going to change those split-second decisions that officers must make. Split-second decisions that law enforcement must make in the city of New York, particularly when confronted with a dangerous situation or when their life or the life of another individual is being threatened. It will not change those situations. There are reasonable protections that officers need in situations like those. And that, my friends, should not change and will not change. That is not what these reforms are about. But there are fact-specific cases where officers could have used non-lethal force to contain the situation or restrain the individual or to effectuate an arrest. In addition to the reforms, this bill will also establish a new criminal offense and penalties for police officers who employ force that is grossly in excess of what is warranted under the circumstances and where that force causes physical injury or death. And that means that even if it's determined that an officer is justified in using some force, if they are found to have used far more force than is necessary, they can potentially face a new criminal charge. And the severity of that crime depends upon the circumstances and depends upon the injuries caused. But it would give prosecutors a critical additional tool to hold officers accountable for wrongdoing. It's a gray area that has been outlined and identified by prosecutors in our office charged with investigating police-related killings. In just a few minutes, you will hear from Gwen Carr, the mother of Eric Garner. Eric Garner was killed in 2015 after an NYPD officer used an illegal chokehold on Mr. Garner, who repeatedly told the officer he could not breathe. We cannot be fully certain about how these new reforms would have applied in that case, because the grand jury minutes, as all of you know, were never unsealed despite our efforts. And that's another area of reform that we need. We need more transparency in the grand jury process because we need to know what happens behind closed doors. But what we do know in the Eric Garner case is that with these reforms, prosecutors would have had an alternative means of scrutinizing the conduct of the officer and determining whether or not the amount of force that was used against Mr. Garner was grossly in excess of what was warranted under the circumstances. These reforms will not only help us to hold police officers accountable for wrongdoing, but I believe will dissuade officers from using unnecessary force in the first place. And this is not something that is new. This is not a unique approach to the use of force. On the federal level, you have the George Floyd Justice Policing Act, which has passed in the House, includes, among other things, a requirement that officers only use lethal force as a last resort, and new reporting requirements about the use of excessive force by law enforcement officers. On a state level, my colleague in New Jersey, State Attorney General Grewal, recently took action to amend the state rules on use of force to ensure lethal force is only used as a last resort. And earlier this month, the city of Sacramento California passed the last resort standard for police use of force. And in the state of California, Washington, they also took similar action. Police officers are imbued with the incredible amount of police power and state power, and the state has every right to demand that that power is used as seldom as possible, and when it must be used, only appropriately and proportionately. We need real accountability and clear standards for when that use of force is acceptable and when it is not. We need real consequences for when an officer crosses the line. And while this legislation is certainly not a cure-all for all of the ills of our criminal justice system, it is a critical step forward. But there is much more work to be done. And so we are also examining and beginning to engage in conversations about mental illness and ensuring that mental health professionals are responding to situations where their expertise is needed, and other areas of reform. But today we are introducing this policy. And while there will be no justice as long as groups of people in this country are unequally killed, my hope is that today with this legislation, we can provide clear and concise and objective standards. We are yet another step closer to the fairer and more equal justice system that we all deserve, but most importantly, that is required under our Constitution and our law. At this point in time, I'd like to introduce Ms. Gwen Carr, the mother of Eric Garner, who's been a tireless advocate for change. Ms. Carr?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gwen Carr. I am the mother of Eric Garner. As you know, almost 7 years ago, my son was murdered by NYPD. He said, "I can't breathe," 11 times. And 11 times they decided not to let him live. And we all saw the video. So we know that it was excessive force that was used. And my son should have been alive today if the police officer would have followed protocol or if there was any accountability. All those officers who was on my son's neck, on my son's back, and police officer who looked the other way, they all should have been fired and criminal charges should have been brought forward. And there could be no justice without accountability. This is what we need, accountability. And it doesn't matter if you wear blue jeans or a blue suit or a blue uniform, there should be accountability. As we know, the laws in New York are written to shield bad actors in the police department. None of them stands accountable because that law is set aside altogether for them. It's just like it doesn't exist. Anything that they do, they get excused from it. They fear for their life. And they're the ones who are armed and deadly, and not us. We are tired of having our black and browns murdered by the police, our unarmed black and brown, the ones who are terrorized by the police. This has to stop. This is why this legislation being announced by Attorney General Tish James is so important. It represents the first major step in this nation to bring about change. The police use of force law, it's just, we can't just keep on going on this way. We have to have some new legislation. The goal of this reform is to reduce the deaths, and I say to eliminate the deaths of unarmed and people of color, because it's just that it's gone too far. And we are so unproportionately, unjustly killed at the hands of police. And I just want to thank Attorney Tish James for what she is doing, bringing about this legislation, because we know that there is more work that we have to do. This is not going to change the minds and the hearts of those bad actors. But we have to have some accountability to let them know they're not just going to get away with it. It's not just going to be swept under the rug when you just kill us and say, oh, well, or oops. No, that doesn't work. You cannot bring back a life. So I just urge everyone who is going to vote on this to give it a yes vote. I urge all of you to please give the prosecutor another tool to work with so that when these cases, when there's a death in these cases, that we could have a fairer playing ground. And we want the prosecutors to do this without prejudice, because we know a lot of times things are not handled in the right way. But I thank you again, Attorney General, because a lot of people will not step out and do this because they are afraid. They're afraid of the pushback. But I've learned long time ago, when they push, we have to push back. So I thank you. Thank you so much.
And now the Senate sponsor of the bill, Senator Kevin Parker.
Thank you, Attorney General. I'm State Senator Kevin Parker. Good afternoon. I represent the 21st District in Brooklyn. I'm the Majority Whip in the New York State Senate, as well as the Chairman of the Energy and Telecommunications Committee. And first, let me thank the Attorney General for convening us in this way and for our leadership on this critical issue. After the murder of George Floyd last year, the state of New York was the first state in the entire country to pass a set of legislative initiatives addressing the issue of police reform. I have been fortunate to have been in position to be one of those leaders in this body on this issue. And we passed very important bills, including a bill that created body cameras for state police, a bill that I passed with Assemblyman Nick Perry, who's joined us today, that reaffirms the right to record police activity in the state. And also, I passed a law that creates an Office of Police Misconduct right here in the Attorney General's office. That set of legislation, although important, was really just the first step on a long journey that we have to take in this state to make sure that we have a police department that serves and protects, but does it with dignity and respect. We need accountability. We need transparency. And what this legislation that the Attorney General is introducing today takes another important step on that journey. In this moment, as we talk about excessive use of force, it really is a term of poetry. We say it, but it doesn't really have any force in the law. What the Attorney General is doing today is putting teeth into that law. And so I'm happy to be the Senate sponsor. I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues in the Senate, and want to thank our leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, for assigning this bill to me. And I'm looking forward to us passing this not just as a standalone, but hopefully with a group of other legislation around police reform, and so that we really can be a place where people are protected and simultaneously respected. Thank you so much.
The Assembly sponsor, Assemblymember Nick Perry.
Thank you. Thank you, esteemed Attorney General. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to join the AG's office, the Attorney General, working with advocates and those who have suffered under the current system to put forward this legislation. And I really commend the Attorney General for taking up the battle. A few months ago, we got in contact about a bill I'd introduced, and I must say that what the Attorney General has proposed is 10 times better than the original effort that we put forward, which means that there are very good people in our office, very qualified and very informed. So that this bill, the Police Accountability Act, is going to make a big difference. The record shows that over the last year, over 960 Americans were killed during encounters with the police. Sadly, Black Americans are 3 times more likely to die in such encounters with the police. So based on these statistics, New Yorkers who look like me, who could be my son, my daughter, my wife, any relative of mine, AG, my sponsor in the Senate, and even white Americans, because 40% of white Americans account for the numbers killed in encounters with the police. And all of this is enabled by a use of force guidelines that have allowed 115 New Yorkers this year alone to have been killed by the use of deadly force under the current protocol that the police operate. Without a trial, without a verdict, without a sentence, and with no due process whatsoever. The significant changes that we are proposing in New York are long overdue. And I'm so excited to join in this effort with our trailblazing Attorney General to make sure that this becomes the new standard by which police will use when faced with the decision of whether or not to use deadly force. My Senate colleague and I promise that we will work as hard as we can, expeditiously, to pass this bill into law and welcome the dawn of better policing to keep our families alive and safe. Thank you.
I'd like to acknowledge Graham Witherspoon from the Amadou Diallo Foundation. Thank you for being here. Our next speaker is the Deputy Leader of the New York State Senate. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Deputy Leader Michael Gineris.
Good afternoon. First, let me thank our Attorney General, Tish James. She does such tremendous work, not only on the issue we're here to discuss today, but on so many. We have worked hand in glove with her to move this state forward, and I am proud to call her our Attorney General. She's a leader not just for our state, but in the nation. And Ms. Carr, it's an honor to be in your presence today on this important issue, and appreciate you sharing once again your pain and your experience with us. There's far too many instances of police misconduct, and every time we see it on the news, there's a reaction, and we push to get things done, and sometimes we do. But more important is to focus on it even when it's not at front and center in the news. Our Senate, since we took the majority, together with Senator Parker and all our colleagues under the leadership of Andrea Stewart-Cousins, has focused on this for the last 3 years. And we have transformed the way people experience our criminal legal system, from first interactions with law enforcement to protecting their rights pre-conviction, to making sure they're treated humanely if one is incarcerated, and to making sure they have support services post-release. But there is so much work to be done that it really never ends. And this proposal by the Attorney General, sponsored by Senator Parker and Assemblyman Perry, is a critical part of that. You'd think it would be simple enough to say we should not authorize someone to take someone's life unless there was no other option. And yet that is not the state of our law right now. Think about that for a second. We do not have the standard in New York that you shouldn't kill somebody unless there's no other option available to law enforcement. This proposal would do that. It does so many other things as well to make sure that those who abuse their power, those who interact with residents of New York in a way that should be legal, will in fact be legal and will be held to account. Too many examples where that wasn't the case. Too many families that have suffered without their loved ones. And this proposal will go a long way towards ending that. And so I want to thank again Attorney General Tish James for her leadership, the sponsors of the bill, my great colleague Senator Parker, as well as Nick Perry, for carrying it forward. And I look forward to the day we can pass it and come back to celebrate its enactment. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Leader. Our next speaker is my very good friend, my sister girlfriend, Assemblymember Catalina Cruz.
The ladies can can attest to how difficult it can be to take these off at times. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Assemblywoman Catalina Cruz. I represent Jackson Heights, Corona, and Elmhurst, and I want to thank our Attorney General first for being at the forefront of not only protecting many members of my community, of the immigrant New Yorkers, but also all of the New Yorkers who, for a very long time, have been waiting for change. Last year at the legislature, we worked on transparency around police issues. But that's not enough. If we really truly want a community that feels safe when they're walking on the street, that feels like the police is there to protect and serve them, then we also need accountability. And we can't expect that when an unfortunate murder, because that's what they are, happens at the hands of police, and we send in the Attorney General to do her job, and she doesn't come back with a conviction, it's not because she didn't do her job, it's because the law is written in a way that does not allow her to do it. And so we as legislators, and I want to thank my colleagues, thank you for taking the leadership. We are going to support you, and we are going to support the families that deserve the justice. Because if we really want to see a change, we have to have accountability. And that's what this bill is going to do, create guidelines that, by the way, as the Attorney General said, are already on many of the police instruction books, but they're not in the law. And so we're going to make sure that that changes this year. Lo voy a decir también en español porque veo aquí varios de los miembros de la prensa latina y es importante que nuestra comunidad latina entienda y se una a esta lucha. Si en verdad queremos cambiar la relación entre la policía y nuestra comunidad, no solamente necesitamos transparencia, que fue lo que hicimos el año pasado, pasando la ley de 50A, pero también necesitamos que los policías que se pasen y asesinen a nuestra comunidad cuando tenían otras alternativas, paguen con cárcel si es necesario. Y esta ley va a cambiar eso y va a empezar un camino donde en verdad vamos a cambiar la relación entre la policía y la comunidad. Le doy las gracias a Tish James, well, you're Tish James to all of us. Nuestra abogada general, nuestra procuradora, hace un buen trabajo en no solo luchar por nuestras comunidades inmigrantes, pero un excelente trabajo en crear justicia para todas las personas en este estado que se lo merecen. Sin ella, mucha de la justicia que ahora tenemos nunca hubiera pasado. Le pido a nuestra comunidad latina que llamen a sus legisladores cuando esta ley esté ya en pie y le pidan que la apoyen. Porque esto no es un asunto nada más de familias afroamericanas, esto es un asunto de todos los latinos, de todas las personas en este estado. And so that last piece I'll say in English, I want everyone, once we put this law to help us move it forward, call our colleagues, call people who would support it, because this isn't a Latino issue, this isn't a black issue, this is an every person issue. We have to make sure that our black and brown communities are no longer murdered at the hands of police. And if we don't pass this law, it's going to continue to happen, and then we're not going to get the justice that our community deserves. Thank you.
Sí se puede. Finally, I want to introduce Michael Cizetsky. He's the Senior Policy Counsel for the New York Civil Liberties Union. Mr. Cizetsky?
Thank you, Attorney General James. So my name is Michael Cizetsky, Senior Policy Counsel with the New York Civil Liberties Union. Last summer, New Yorkers experienced an overwhelming level of state violence directed at members of the public carried out by police officers. In response to demands for accountability in the wake of yet another police killing of an unarmed black man, officers here in New York drove their vehicles into crowds of protesters, violently shoved people to the ground, and indiscriminately pepper sprayed New Yorkers as a means of punishment and intimidation. And in the wake of public criticism and condemnation, police officials claimed that their use of force was justified. These are not new issues. The NYCLU has long demanded that police departments do more to prevent use of force and to punish abusive officers. But so long as state law continues to grant officers wide latitude to use force, even when alternatives are available, too many officers will continue to wield state-sanctioned violence with impunity. So the NYCLU welcomes the introduction of this legislation. Experience has shown us that it's not enough for current law to simply permit officers to use force that they deem necessary. We need clearer standards in the law to establish that no amount of force can be used if it could otherwise be avoided or reduced. And it's imperative that an officer's own actions leading up to any use of force factor into the equation here. It's not enough to just look at the situations at the moment when an officer pulls the trigger. The law must hold officers accountable for their own conduct that is all too often the reason that these encounters escalate and that force gets used in the first place. So this bill takes important steps towards raising that legal bar. And we look forward to working with the Attorney General and with the bill sponsors to ensure that as it moves forward, we establish clear mandates in the law that require that officers actually attempt to de-escalate and exhaust all available options prior to using force, and to consider additional restrictions to mitigate potential harms and risks of abuse. So the NYCLU will also continue to call for broader transformations in our approach to public safety that focus more fundamentally on reducing the size, scope, and authority of policing as an institution. Updating and tightening our use of force laws is one of the ways that we can reduce the amount of harm caused by our overinvestment in policing, but it won't be enough without a more holistic reimagining and redefining of community safety and the role of law enforcement. So we look forward to working with the Attorney General and the bill sponsors to achieve those broader goals as well. Thank you again.
Before we open it up for questions, let me just read from the Patrol Guide, procedure number 221-02, titled Tactical Operations, Use of Force. When a member of the service must gain compliance, control, or custody of an uncooperative subject, the member should comply with the force guidelines, take necessary action to protect life and personal safety of all persons present, utilize de-escalation techniques, isolate and contain the subject if appropriate, immediately request a supervisor, request additional members as necessary, request the response of emergency service unit, and apply no more than the reasonable force necessary to gain control. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Will there be any retroactive element to this legislation? Can you go back on some cases that you're talking about that have occurred in New York in the past years, or is this moving forward?
It's all prospective. It's not retroactive. Next question? Yes.
Just wondering, what is the current status of the bill? Has it just been introduced, and what is the next steps?
So it has just been introduced, and in terms of the next step, I'll defer to my colleagues in the state legislature, both in the Assembly and the Senate. Senator Parker, Assemblymember Perry.
The bill is already introduced in the Senate. It will be introduced, probably being done as I speak, in the Assembly. The process requires vetting through the committee, and the committee process will move it to the floor, and we'll try to do that as expeditiously as we can, working together.
Yes, as Assemblyman Perry indicated, in both houses, it simply runs the same way. You introduce a bill in the Senate. We've already introduced it. It's sitting in committee. The committee will consider it. Once it's moved out of committee, it will go to the floor and be considered by the entire House. Once the bill, which is what we call a same as, exact language in both bills, gets passed by both houses, it then goes to the governor to be signed into law.
Also, please know that you may notice a sort of bias towards Brooklyn. Please know that the leaders selected the sponsors of the bill. Any other questions? Can we go virtual? Oh, there's one.
Yeah, just on that note, have your legislative partners been able to gauge support for it potentially going forward, or does it seem like something that might be a big challenge?
Well, I think it's premature, but
I know that there are 3 other legislators in my house that had introduced bills with the same intention, vary in different ways as to the actual methods. But my read of it, having been in the Assembly for quite a long time, and I have focused a lot of my service on police reform, justice reform bills, and I have a sense that there is significant support, and we are all aware that this is not about going after the police. It's not for the police officers that abuse their authority. It's for those who are or are inclined to misuse the power, the awesome power that we give them, and there is public support for this, and that's what we're working with.
Yeah, I can tell you both as the Senate sponsor and the majority whip in the New York State Senate, that there is actually a real big appetite for justice in our state. And that's what I see and what I hear when we're in conference and the conversations that I'm having with my colleagues. And so we expect that we will have votes not just for this legislation, but hopefully for a package of legislation on the issue of police reform. And as the whip, I promise that we will use no more force than is necessary to get the votes. That was a joke. Don't go.
Yes. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Have you been in conference with any other state attorney generals to have them possibly to do this in other states? Or have you been in contact with the Justice Department to ask them to look at the practices and the patterns of the departments, especially NYPD, especially what happened last summer, getting the Justice Department involved as well?
So let me just say that there are some attorney generals. We had a conference. A number of us, primarily attorney generals from blue states, support the George Floyd Policing Act. In the George Floyd Policing Act, the attorney general from Illinois, Kwame Raoul, and I, we both pushed members of Congress to include in that federal bill provisions that would allow attorney generals to engage in investigation and pattern and practice cases. That is still in the bill. It has not been dropped, and we are hoping that both houses of Congress, I believe it passed in the House but not in the Senate, we are hoping that Leader Schumer will be successful in getting that bill passed in the United States Senate. And we do know that President Biden and Vice President Harris are in support. As I mentioned in my comments, the Attorney General from New Jersey, Graywall, was the first to pass use of force reforms. And there are a number of attorney generals who are considering the same. And we have weekly, if not daily, conversations with respect to a wide range of issues, including but not limited to a broken criminal justice system.
We're going to go take some questions virtually now. So
we'll now move to virtual questions. Our first question is from Eileen Lepalmer from News 12. Eileen, your mic is open.
Hi there. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So the question on police reform in general in the state, as you know, all the municipalities had to submit their police reform plans by April 1st. And I'm just curious if your office has assigned a monitor yet to look into any individual police departments who did not comply with that order.
So at this point, our Civil Rights Bureau is looking into those reform recommendations. And at this point in time, I cannot comment on whether or not we are looking at any particular jurisdiction or municipality in the state of New York.
Thank you. Our next question is from Steve Burns from WCBS Radio. Steve, your mic is open.
Hi, Attorney General. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. Just a question regarding, how police officers may take this law. I mean, we had a dialogue last summer, the NYPD and what they call the diaphragm law, where they basically said these greater restrictions on their actions may lead to a chilling effect, and they may be more hesitant to go after some of the more dangerous elements of the community. Do you foresee that being an issue? How concerned are you with that potential chilling effect with these bills?
So as I mentioned in my comments, again, this will not affect and or change those split-second decisions that police officers have to make on the streets of New York City. By no means. All that this does is, again, codify what is already in the patrol guide for the city of New York. It's important also to understand that I too not describe to the politics of fear. And what we need to do is work together to heal the rift that exists between certain communities and law enforcement, not only in the city, but all throughout the nation of the city of New York. And we are attempting to do just that.
Thank you. Our next question is from Aaron Bessaker from the Buffalo News. Aaron, your line is open.
Good afternoon. There have been a number of police use of force cases in Buffalo that your office has investigated in recent years. Are there any of those cases you think could have ended up differently if these changes would have been in place?
So I'm not going to speculate or look back as to whether or not the outcome would have been different. I know that this is a tool in our toolbox going forward, which will address, obviously, an issue that unfortunately has a policy and a practice that continues, that needs to be reformed. And again, all that this does is ensure that police officers use other non-lethal methods of of restraint against individuals, as opposed to resorting to lethal uses of force at the outset. And again, all of those recommendations and proposals are laid out in the patrol guide for members of law enforcement in the city of New York. And I also want to state that at a time of racial reckoning in this country, it's important that we reform the laws and that we provide justice for all individuals who feel that their lives do not matter.
So now we're going to come back to this room, take 2 off-topic questions. People have them. Please start here.
Attorney General, how are you?
I'm good. How you doing, Andrew?
Good, thank you for asking. A senior advisor to Governor Cuomo said that your investigation of the governor may be unfair or compromised because both you and the controller have spoken to people about running for governor, and it's unethical to wield criminal referral authority to further political self-interest. Can you respond to that and also tell the people of New York how close to conclusion your investigation of the governor is?
So let me begin by saying our investigation will conclude when it concludes. It's very thorough and comprehensive. And 2, I'm not going to respond to any personal attacks on me and or my office. I deal with over 1,800 employees who are professional, who come to work each and every day, focusing on the law and the facts, and politics stops at the door. And so anything other than that, obviously I ignore. We ignore all of those comments. We are doing our work pursuant to an executive order that was issued by the governor of the state of New York. Yes.
Is an investigation in search of a crime. If you would react to that. And also, could you clarify, is your investigation just an assistance of the DA, not a separate investigation? Is that accurate?
So to be clear, our civil investigation continues, but we are now actively investigating the Trump Organization in a criminal capacity, and we are working alongside, cooperating with the Manhattan District Attorney, Cy Vance. As was mentioned, I believe in some newspaper, 2 of our assistant attorney generals have been cross-designated as district attorneys. That's it? Oh, okay. Thank you.